Good afternoon. This lecture today is about a very tragic set of events that have been taking place in Myanmar, which perhaps is a very remote country for many people, and therefore it has really largely passed under the radar. And we don't know enough to really care. I hope that this short talk will get us started thinking in the right direction and to ask the question how we can stop the genocide that is going on for quite some time of the Rohingya people in northern Myanmar. To give a little bit of historical background, this part of what used to be called Burma was remote enough, divided by a mountain range, so that for most of the history this was an independent kingdom with annexation by Burma only for 40 years between 1784 and 1826. In 1826, the British, who already had India as the crown jewel of their colonies, won a series of wars with Burma and annexed all of Burma. And so this northern part, which was called Northern Arakan, also became part of the British Empire and part of the unit the British called Burma. And this basically meant that the British could continue their tested policy of divide and rule. They did nothing to really build communal harmony or to bring these different peoples together. When Burma finally, first it was separated from India in 1936-37, and then in 1948, Burma became independent. But in between there was the Second World War, and during the Second World War, many Burmese nationalists, including the father of the present person who is formally, I suppose, or de facto quite often acclaimed as the leader of the people. Her father was one of the leaders of this resistance movement to colonialism and initially supported the Japanese. And the British created a counterforce in many parts, but especially in northern Arakan, using the Rohingyas and created some of their leaders who really wanted autonomy for that region. That was their ultimate goal, just as the ultimate goal of the Burmese nationalists was to have independence from British rule, which finally was achieved in 1948. But this British policy during the war also did much to divide the people, and it's not surprising that throughout the history of modern Burma and then Myanmar, we have many separatist movements in evidence, especially the Karen and the Shan, and those movements have been actually more powerful than the Rohingya movement. From 1948 to 1962, before the military coup in then Burma by Ne Win, the government, especially under Wu Nu, allowed the Rohingyas to participate in the political process. So they were accepted as citizens, and their rights, such as they were the same as all other citizens of the Union of Burma. But in 1962, there was a coup by General Ne Win, and Burma declared itself nominally to be socialist, but it's a good question as to what kind of socialism it really was. If anything, it really was a military dictatorship separated from the people. Therefore, it cannot be really identified with any kind of socialist program for the people. The state really became the most powerful actor in society, and people who controlled the state benefited from whatever policies were undertaken during this period. And in 1974, they actually passed a new constitution which excluded minorities, especially Rohingyas, from citizenship. In 1982, that was even strengthened with the Citizenship Act, and you had to show that your ancestors were in that area in 1824. Given the lack of records, it would be difficult for just about anybody, and it was even more difficult for the Rohingyas who were in Burma for only 40 years, as I said. Rest of the time they were quasi-independent or independent or even a dominating force. Given this stance, it became difficult. But even so, in 1988, after the fall of the government, the elections took place in 1990, Rohingyas were allowed to participate. But these things became less possible with the Constitution of 2008, which explicitly excluded Rohingyas, declared them as foreigners and part of Bangladesh, not really of Burma or Myanmar. Given this stance, it became easy to find official justification to expel these people through a policy of state terrorism. And that's how the great Rohingya expulsion became. It was, of course, begun much earlier, as I said, and especially after 1974, it gained momentum. As a result, now more than 700,000, some people will say a million, of the Rohingyas are in refugee camps in various parts of Bangladesh. Some are in Malaysia and Indonesia also, but majority are in Bangladesh, which itself is a poor country. So it is very difficult to take care of all these refugees, and there are fears also of political instability in the region. So given all this, Bangladesh has been trying to find a negotiated solution so that these refugees can go back and be resettled in the land from which they had come. But so far, no progress has been made, and the ones who remain in Myanmar today face intolerance and repression. Recently, the UN fact-finding mission published a report which runs into many hundreds of pages, and the chair of that mission, Marzuki, actually said that it was a genocide and that Myanmar authorities were not paying any attention. It was confirmed also by Ms. Lee, who is the UN special investigator of human rights of refugees. So we find that the UN has in effect taken a position that it is an ongoing genocide. The pressure on the Rohingyas really became more and more intense after the 2008, as I said, and nobody paid much attention because that region in, it's called Rakhine province now, northern Rakhine, is quite poor. It's not mineral rich, at least by recent accounts, but there are offshore oil and gas possibilities, and all coastline in Burma is important in that way, geopolitically and geoeconomically. And we'll come back to that aspect later towards the end of this talk. But other parts of Myanmar are much richer in terms of mineral resources. But it is important ideologically for Myanmar authorities to keep Burma as a unit so that the other more militant minorities like Karen and Shan do not think that they can break away from Myanmar too easily. So there are these considerations, and the solution that is being proposed by Bangladesh in particular is an orderly repatriation of the refugees and the resettlement of those refugees with citizenship rights in Myanmar. Elections took place in 2015, and Rohingyas were excluded from that election. So they have no official voice in the Myanmar polity, such as it is. And at the top of the government, we have a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and yet she has not said very much about the human rights aspects of what is going on. And to make things worse, the people who stay inside in Myanmar, they had some white cards which gave them an identity card, but even they were confiscated and they were rounded up, many of them, and put into internal concentration camps. So this is reminiscent of pogroms and policies, really Nazi-like policies that were followed in other historical circumstances in other places. The regime seems to be intent on manufacturing anti-Rohingya ideology and ethnic hostility. This is not, of course, the official position of the regime, but the regime seemingly condones much of the extremist movement that also exists within the borders of Myanmar. So we could ask who the main players are in this. Army certainly is the force behind the scenes that controls much of what is going on, and in that sense, one might say that the party of the people, if we can use that expression, the National League for Democracy, is at a disadvantage because the party that army has set up, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, has to be given 25% of the seats no matter what. So even if they lose the election, they still have a lot of power. And that's what really has happened with the 2015 elections. And army certainly doesn't mind being tough with all ethnic minority movements. There are some other ethnic regional parties, but they are not very prominent. The only group that doesn't have any ethnic regional party is the Rohingya group. And that would make us question about political participation and how internal negotiated political solution can be arrived at. The fourth major group of actors we can identify as Buddhist monks. And here we should not be hasty in putting them all in one group, because there are genuine compassionate Buddhists among them who try to help individually and sometimes in more organized ways, Rohingyas and other oppressed individuals and families. But the majority of the monks, at least the focal parts, they have formed movements like 969, which is a very right-wing, ideologically dogmatic movement centered around supposedly Buddha's teachings, but basically non-Buddhist elements in Myanmar society and polity. There is also the Mabata movement, which is even more strident and very vehement in terms of forming paramilitary groups and collaborating with the army to carry out violent acts against minorities, especially Rohingyas. Then we can identify as a fifth set of forces the civil society groups, but they are extremely weak, although many are really quite open-minded and democratic. One group, for example, Panzagar, is very decent and tries to work with Muslims and other minorities, but it is very weak. And ideologically, they are not given any support or even much access by the regime. So it does pose a very serious problem for the international community, because it doesn't seem realistic to hope that something internal will happen in Burma in a desirable direction to stop the genocide and to start a normal democratic political process. So I think the first thing that we would want to happen is really a recognition, and I have 6 points basically that I will articulate to wrap up this small talk. The first thing, or first point, is to accept the simple proposition that Myanmar is not on the road to liberal democracy today. The official propaganda, of course, still presents Myanmar in that way, and the Nobel Prize that was given is used as a symbol of that recognition. And yet, if one soberly looks at the events that have taken place, at least since 2008, it seems that Myanmar has continued to becoming not only illiberal, but probably quite fascistic in the way that it is treating the Rohingyas in particular. So we have to become disillusioned and disabused of the notion that it is democratic or it is on the road to being democratic. At the same time, that should give us the resolve to find democratic elements within Myanmar and to work with them, to strengthen them, to use their resources so that negotiations can take place at some point, because the only way to move forward would be to start negotiations honestly and perhaps with the help of some honest brokers from abroad. So my second point is with the regional organization, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which Myanmar is a member, and ASEAN has already taken some initiatives because 2 powerful members of ASEAN, at least Malaysia and Indonesia, are very concerned. It's probably not accidental that the chairman of the Human Rights Fact-Finding Commission came from Indonesia, Mr. Marzuki. ASEAN would be a proper forum regionally to work from and work with and to launch further initiatives from. Thirdly, the civil society movements, as I mentioned before, these movements for reconciliation must be supported in various ways. And this can happen from ASEAN as well. Fourth, the country that is bearing the brunt of this forced migration of people, expulsion of people, and genocide is Bangladesh. And Bangladesh has tried to take some initiatives, but these bilateral initiatives have been ignored by Myanmar government so far, because they stick to their claim that these are foreigners and therefore they have no right in Myanmar. But Bangladesh cannot really succeed from what we have seen without putting this in the multilateral context internationally and being helped by international actors. And in the region again, the key international actors other than Malaysia and Indonesia and other ASEAN countries would be China, India, and Japan. And they have their own reasons to cultivate good relationships with Myanmar government because of the resources, because of the geopolitical and geoeconomic situations. But I would argue that they actually need to consider long-term prospects for a stable Myanmar with which they can deal and make, in fact, business and economic deals as well as political settlements about international sea line and things like that to peacefully develop and benefit from mutual trade and investment, etc. And finally, to realize this, UN also needs to get involved. It is already involved to some extent, as I have said, but it needs to be involved more. And that means that it has to have the support of the members of the Security Council, not just China, which is, of course, a member of the Security Council, but also the other permanent members like US in particular, and Russia and France and UK. So these are the things that we need to think about carefully. And ultimately, I think it is in the interest of all these powers to have a stable, peaceful Myanmar, Bangladesh, Bay of Bengal, and to make it strategically a place where movement of goods and people can take place without hindrance. So that is my recommendation. Thank you.